Welcome back. It's the Big Blue Banter, New York Giants football podcast. I'm Dan Schneier. Joined as always, my co-host Nick Velato. Training camp's almost here. Actually, it is. The rookies reported today, and starting next week, at the end of next week, I think we're going to start to get going on some practices. So it came faster than usual this year. I think Hard Knocks played a role in that, having that excitement. And today is actually, when we're recording this, I'm not sure when this is going to drop, so I actually shouldn't give dates. Nick always tells me not to do that, and he's right, because we don't know when we're dropping stuff. But we have more Hard Knocks to go over, which I'm excited for as we roll into training camp. And I'm really excited about getting into camp, because that's when we're going to start to see if this team has made progress. Today, we're talking about the offensive line in our position preview. There's a lot to talk about with this group, and I thought John Schmelk did an amazing job interviewing a lot of different offensive linemen. So we're going to talk a lot about what we learned through those interviews, because I think it's going to have a big impact on this season. But Nick, before we get there, how are you doing, my friend? It's been a little while.
I'm doing well, man. Just working, enjoying the little bit of summer that we have left before we bleed it right into training camp and then right into the preseason and then right into the season where it is full throttle until next year's draft.
You're damn right. And before we get going, I want to share a quick thing. Just because I love these types of stories. On last Friday, I golfed with my brother at Hendricks Golf Course. And as I walked into the golf course, I saw a guy with a Giants polo on. So I said, "Hey, man, nice polo." And he goes immediately, "Holy shit, Dan Schneier, what's up?" And so I just wanted to shout out Nick, listener of the podcast, who we golfed with. We golfed right behind, actually. It was him and his girlfriend or wife or fiance, I'm not sure. And after the round, me and my brother went to a bar. I think it's Michael's Roscommon house right around Hendricks Golf Course. And he was there too, eating with his girlfriend, right, fiance, whoever she was. And it was just such a weird coincidence. And it was so cool to see a listener. And then today, another one of these kind of occurrences, Nick, they literally make my day, because it's just such a cool experience and feeling. Udi, who I used to play basketball with at O'Connor, all the time we used to ball at O'Connor. That's a park right around my house. Grew up in West Orange, New Jersey, Nick. He just shouted me out. He's like, "Dude, craziest thing. I've been listening to your podcast, you and Nick, for years, not knowing that we used to play basketball all the time. And on Saturday, me and my boys were talking about a Big Blue Banter episode. And they're like, "Dude, we used to play basketball with him all the time at O'Connor." It's just such a cool small world thing, man. And just cool to know that, like, we have the support from people like this, that we, common people that we see and we play with, golf, basketball, whatever it may be, Nick. So it just makes me feel good as we head into the season. I told them both, like, they were both very skeptical, and I understand why, but I told them both, it's going to be worth it when we finally get good, and this team is like good to talk about on a consistent basis. Please stick with us. We will be there eventually. I don't know when, hopefully sooner rather than later.
I'm right there with you, and I'm guessing that the buddies you played basketball with used to dominate you, right?
Oh, of course. I'm a 5'8" Jewish kid. I mean, I got minimal athleticism. I found my sports, Nick. It's tennis and golf. Those are going to be my sports.
No, but I'll say this: when it comes to basketball, you're damn A+ defense. Effort through the roof.
Team defense is through the roof. Hustles through the roof. I'm going for every loose ball. You know how it is. You got to make up in some ways for your lack of height and athleticism, and that is how I do it, or how I used to do it. I don't play much basketball anymore. It's been 5 years, which sucks, because it is literally the best workout in the world. You don't even feel like you're working out, and you're burning thousands of calories. So just awesome. But let's talk about the Giants offensive line, Nick, because this is the unit that is one of two. There's two things that will determine this season as far as if they're going to be a surprise team like 2022, make the playoffs, maybe make a run. It's one, the quarterback, and it's two, the offensive line. That's how it is. That's how it's been for a long time. Since Eli Manning, that's how it's been. You can say back in the Eli Manning days, one of those two things was still true, Nick. The offensive line was a disaster for half of Eli's career at least, but we at least had the quarterback position locked in. Now they have to find a way to get consistent production out of both the quarterback and the offensive line. So with the offensive line, there's a lot of changes that are coming this year, both from a personnel standpoint and from a coaching standpoint. Let's start with the coaching standpoint, Nick. What are your expectations as we get to training camp? And what have you maybe learned through listening to John Schmelk interview this offensive line? Because I felt like what I took away the most was a consistent discussion of what Carmen Porcello brings. And there was a lot to unpack there. And I feel like it's going to be very, very, very different coaching style entirely, really, than what they got from Bobby Johnson.
I'm not doubting that everything that you just said could be true, but how many times have we gone through offensive line coaches, Dan? And this was kind of the description, right? Like, we're detail oriented, we're going to change things up. We want you, if you're a veteran, to maintain your style, but at the same time, there are non-negotiables. And we're like, yeah, it's going to be good. And it might be good in the beginning, but then when some mistakes start to happen and some games start to be lost, is there going to be finger pointing? And I don't want to sound too cynical here. And I am optimistic that there's just a change in the offensive line room, because there had to be a change at the coaching position with how bad and dreadful this position group has been. And I'm very hopeful for Carmen Brasillo, but until I actually see it translate on the field, I don't want to get too hyped about it, if I'm just going to be frank.
I think that's fair. I think we should take a step back, but I think we could also look at it and say there might be notable differences that we see that can start to prop up. I won't say in training camp. Again, you guys know how I feel about training camp, a little bit overrated, but in the preseason, because that's an area where the Giants offensive line has even struggled, to be quite frank. Like, we've had bad offensive line play throughout preseasons, and it's led to bad offensive line play in week ones of seasons and then carried over through the year. So I'm going to look to start to see improvement in our preseason games this year, Nick. But I will say this, there's been a lot of changes. You can look at what Andrew Thomas said. And this is just through the offseason program, by the way, right? Like, they got the basis in of the mental side of it in the OTAs and the mandatory minicamp. And then there's going to be a lot of differences as far as training camp goes with a coaching standpoint. But, Andrew Thomas says there's different techniques from a physical standpoint. In the run game, Carmen Brasillo teaches different things, like a rocker step on inside zone based on linebacker alignment. He says in the passing game, a big difference is he wants us to get a lot more vertical in our sets. And then Andrew Thomas said, I like the changes because I went back and I watched my film, and Thomas was saying, I have a very similar set in every protection. And what he said is, and I thought this was really interesting from Andrew Thomas, he wants to get better on taking different types of sets because that'll allow him to be less predictable as an offensive lineman. It's so funny listening to Thomas, man, because it feels like he's on like a different level from most offensive linemen with the Giants or just across the NFL. It's almost like taking Madden from rookie to an all-pro level, because he's thinking about like, okay, my sets are good. I watch them on tape. They're really consistent, but I need to now think about something different, like being less predictable. Like, most of us were worrying about just getting your set right, Evan Neal, getting your set right, JMS. With Thomas, it's that next level. It's making his sets less predictable. But it's really interesting, I thought, to hear some of those like technical things that Thomas brought up about different things Brasillo's already teaching.
Yeah, and one thing he also mentioned about sets is Brasillo wants to incorporate a little bit more vertical sets, is what Andrew Thomas said. And he was the first player to be interviewed by John Schmelk on the podcast. And I'll say this too, man. Look, when you're playing up to the 90th and 95th percentile of offensive tackle play in the National Football League, those are the types of things that you focus on because you have everything down pat. Now it's just, hey, I become predictable. And when I'm going up against the Nick Bosas of the world, and when I'm going up against the best defensive linemen and edge rushers in the world, they know how to time my set because it is predictable. So now let me just master varying said set. So I'm glad that Andrew Thomas has that understanding of what to do to combat the best of the best.
Yeah, and I wonder, because this was a big talking point throughout these interviews with Schmelk, the big talking point being that the biggest change he's noticed, and then every single player corroborated this and said this is the case, is that Carmen Brasillo is more of a teacher, less of a coach, in the sense of not yelling, rah, rah, rah. It's more of just teaching and understanding and thinking about stuff. And he obviously came up through Dante Scarnecchia, who a lot of people believe, former Patriots offensive line coach, is the best of all time, or one of the best of all time. And I think he was very similar ilk, not much of a yeller, more of a teacher. What I also found similar and interesting about that is when they asked, sorry, what are you laughing at?
I'm just laughing because it all comes from the Patriot camp, and Giant fans are quite familiar with that rhetoric.
Oh, you're right. With the Joe Judge.
Yeah, exactly.
You could be sold. Look, every team's going to be sold a bill of goods. Every fan base, I should say, is going to be sold a bill of goods. Sometimes you're going to pay off on that bill of goods, though. Like, it's not always good. It hasn't worked out for us in a while, but it's not always not going to work out. When it works 100%. Out, you'll go back to these, reference points of what has changed. And I think this will be a big change. But I thought what was also interesting is when they interviewed, when Schmelke interviewed Runyon, he was like, look, I'm going to be quite frank with you. This offense is very different than anything I've ever been a part of. It's taking me a long time to get used to the terminology. But guess who he said has made a big difference from a mental standpoint? John Michaels. And he's gotten a lot of hype and praise from a lot of the different players they interviewed. And I think that goes into a big reason why they drafted JMS at 55 or whatever it was, 52, 53, 54, 55. I don't remember the exact pick. Because of the mental side, that was something that Bobby Johnson stressed in their interviews and his one-on-ones with him. And I think it's something that could play a big role in getting this offense up to speed in a new system with a new offensive line coach. What do you think about that?
you're right. I think there are a lot of moving parts there. I think John Michael Schmitz, you heard John Runyon, you heard Jermaine Illuminor, I think, mentioned something about it. There was another offensive lineman. Let's see. Yeah, Runyon really was specific about how far along he came. I think it was it Jermaine Illuminor who kept calling him Schmitz or Schmidt or something like that. Yeah, Schmidt. Either way, I think the development of John Michael Schmitz from a mental standpoint, and John Michael Schmitz said several times, he mentioned and alluded to maturing. He's like, I really needed to mature, and I matured through this offseason. And what exactly that means, he was saying that he did it on the field and off field. I think that's important, but also just the presence of Jermaine Illuminor. This is something that we mentioned for a long time now. Just him being with Carmen Brasillo and him kind of acting, as John Schmeltz said, as a player's coach, just to help the rest of the offensive line adjust to and this is where it gets funny, right? Because Jermaine Illuminor is new to this very complex offense. So he has to learn that, but he knows Carmen Brasillo, who's also new to offense. So with John Michael Schmitz being able to also take a leadership role at such a young age to help Illuminor and Runyon, who are going to be playing next to him, that's going to enhance this offensive line if all of these pieces end up coming together. And if Evan Neal, who's the right tackle, if he can be healthy for training camp, and he seemed optimistic about his development. But again, this podcast that we're referencing was back like a month ago. It was in about mid-June. So hopefully there were no setbacks. We haven't heard anything about that. And he's ready to go hit the ground running, and he can play next to Runyon, and Runyon can really help him reach his potential, because that's really, I think, the meat and potatoes behind this offensive line. If we could have one thing happen, in my opinion, other than just being an absolute dumpster fire, it's have Evan Neal live up to being the 7th overall pick in the 2022 NFL draft.
Yeah, it would change the entire outlook of the team. Not only just short term, long term, everything changes if Evan Neal can have a breakout in year 3. You guys may laugh at it, be like, that's not going to happen. I'm so done with him. I don't care. But look, crazier things have happened in the NFL than a player who had really good tape in college, has a really good build, but was injured his first 2 years, broke out in year 3. You're going to act like it's not going to happen. You might be right, but it's not impossible by any means, in my opinion, especially if he has a little bit more consistency next to him on the right side, at guard, especially if he has more consistency at the center part, more integrity on the interior offensive line. And with the third factor, if Carmen Brasillo gets through to him in a different way than Bobby Johnson ever did, which is not impossible, because Runyon also talked about how Carmen Brasillo is just very different in the sense that he has these individual conversations with players about why things happen, how to fix them, and he gives grace in understanding new techniques. And he goes down the line, he was saying. It's not like, a overall coaching type of standpoint where you're just kind of talking to everybody in a general sense. It's very specific in the way that he teaches. And I also thought one thing that I might have missed with Runyon that I thought was interesting, Nick, that I want to get your take on was,
you ever feel sluggish or out of focus? Are you stressed? Has your digestive system caused discomfort or flatulence like a certain co-host on this podcast during a live stream? If so, you should check out AG1. When I started drinking AG1 daily, I could feel a real difference in my daily health. I had more energy, I was better off at the gym, and I could focus on my work in a much more efficient manner. That's because AG1 is a foundational nutrition supplement that supports your body's universal needs like gut optimization, stress management, and immune support. Since 2010, AG1 has led the future of foundational nutrition, continuously refining their formula to create a smarter, better way to elevate your baseline health. Not only did I replace my multivitamin with AG1, but I love that every scoop also includes prebiotics, probiotics, and digestive enzymes for gut support. I recommend AG1 to all my family and friends because AG1 has a team of doctors and scientists that formulate around the latest science and maintains high quality standards within the industry. Even my friends have started drinking AG1, and they always tell me how energetic they feel and how it's helped them out at the gym, and also it's helped them manage their stress levels. That's why we're happy to have AG1 as our partner. If you want to take ownership of your health, it starts with AG1. Try AG1 and get a free 1-year supply of vitamin D3, K2, and 5 free AG1 travel packs when you first subscribe. Go to drinkag1.com/banter. That's drinkag1.com/banter to check it out. Our mental and physical well-being is of the utmost importance. Whether you're a world-class athlete or a podcaster like me, We all need to take that very seriously. That's why I'm excited that Unified Healing is sponsoring this episode of the Big Blue Banter podcast. Unified Healing is a new and super innovative global network of wellness centers powered by Energy Enhancement System, or EE System. If you haven't heard of the EE System yet, you'll want to listen up. This technology promotes wellness, deep relaxation, purification, and rejuvenation. Whether you're here in New York, New Jersey, Arizona, if you will, or hundreds of other locations across the globe, access to a center is easy and affordable. Interested in experiencing the EE System technology for yourself? Go to unifiedhealing.com/banter to learn more and find a center near you. That's UNIFYD healing.com/banter. No material or testimonials on the Unified Healing website are intended to be viewed as medical advice or a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Always seek the advice of your physician or other qualified healthcare providers with any questions you may have regarding a medical condition or treatment. And before undertaking a new healthcare regimen, include EE System.
What he said about John Michael Schmitz, he said he's so fantastic from a mental standpoint that you can't even tell that he's in his second year. This is Runyon on JMS. He says it feels like he's a year 4 or 5 vet, the way he's commanding people at the line of scrimmage, making sure the quarterbacks and running backs are on the same page. And I thought this was really interesting because last offseason, Mike Kafka did a giant space on Twitter. I believe it was last offseason, the one before this one, and talked so much. And one thing they asked him about was the calls, the line of scrimmage, and who's making those calls. And I remember he said the big responsibility was not on the quarterback in this offense. It was on the center. He's connecting with the center, Mike Kafka, and the center is helping set the page. And this is something that's corroborated here with Runyon saying, look, it's JMS making sure the quarterbacks and the running backs are on the same page, like a year 4 or 5 vet from a mental standpoint. So what I want to see this year is more of that deferred. I want to see, we'll see how it goes, but I want to see JMS defer a little bit to the quarterback, Daniel Jones. I want to see Daniel Jones taking more command before the line at the line of scrimmage, before the snap and after the snap, but specifically before the snap. Because, look, you can run your offense any way you want to run it, through the coordinator, through the center, to the quarterback. But, man, those offenses that are really, like as Tom Brady talked about a month or two ago, those offenses where the quarterback has that full command or more command, it seems like they have a step above the rest. So I'm curious to see how that develops with this new offense.
It can be a collaborative effort. If John Michael Schmitz can do that, then that will allow Daniel Jones to focus a little bit more on what's going on with the secondary, what's going on with the second level defenders, and what's going on with the wide receivers, right? And if John Michael Schmitz, according to really Runyon, who said like, hey, this offense, it is difficult. Like we've talked a lot about that with the tight ends and the wide receivers. He was like, learning this offense is difficult. It's different terminology. It's stuff I'm not used to, but John Michael Schmitz is really helping me. And if John Michael Schmitz has developed that level of intellect and that type of mastery and comprehension of this offense, I'd rather have him handle that and have Daniel Jones handle some of the aspects that he has struggled with, because Daniel Jones isn't Peyton Manning. Daniel Jones isn't Tom Brady. And that's not a slight on Daniel Jones. This is just the way it is. It's just the reality of the situation. So I'm fine with having John Michael Schmitz handle that if he can. And it seems like right here in June and July, a lot of the teammates who are new to the squad believe that he can handle that responsibility, and and that John Michael Schmitz is teaching them a lot about this offense.
I think that's fair, Nick. But I also think a part of me is willing to say that is a slight in some ways on Daniel Jones, because having that style of command of your offense, as Tom Brady talked about, gives you such a level up long-term as a team if your quarterback is that guy. And, this is year 6, and I don't think we've seen enough development from Daniel Jones before the snap. We could talk about, it's obvious on film that he hasn't developed after the snap from a process standpoint, but a lot of people can blame that on the O-line. I think they're overlooking a lot of the snaps where he's bailing pockets early. I put one on Twitter earlier. That's fine. You can overlook the film, and that's fine, and you can make your case or say, he's been shell-shocked, and that's why. But the before the snap stuff, that's where he hasn't, in my mind, taken a big enough jump 6 years into his NFL career. And a lot of people assume, because he played at Duke, he was going to be really good before the snap, another Eli in that sense. But what they didn't really factor in was, one, how late he was to football in high school, and two, how much at Duke he didn't have control over the offense. And it was really just Cutcliffe doing everything there and calling the plays in from the sideline, and how that's impacted and hindered his ability to develop before the snap after making it to the NFL. And obviously having a lot of different coaches in the NFL probably hasn't helped either. But regardless of how we got here, we need to get to a point, in my mind at least, where I think he's doing more before the snap. Because if I want to feel confident about him long-term, taking up 15, 14, 20% of your cap, I need to feel confident, in my mind at least, about him being one of those quarterbacks. Because I know no matter what changes, Nick, he's never going to have an elite arm. He's never going to be elite in some other ways, like processing post-snap and moving fast through reads. So I need to know that there's some level that he can get to before the snap that he hasn't reached just yet, personally.
Let's hit singles and take baby steps before we try to get a grand slam.
I want doubles and triples and homers the long term, Nick. I know what you're saying, and your point is very astute, and it's correct. Why am I asking for the doubles, triples, and homers from Jones?
I get it.
We'll need to see the singles. But why I'm asking is, just to be clear real quick, is I set a bar really high for quarterback play in the NFL, especially once you're taking up 14 to 15% of your cap.
That's a completely fair point. But to the John Michael Schmitz discussion, I am glad that he wasn't the most electric interview. He seems very reserved. And John Michael Schmitz, and John Schmelk, also brought up how he seems reserved off the field, but he has this edge to him on the football field. But I did appreciate when he discussed his pass set. He said his initial pass set specifically is one aspect of his 2023 game that he wants to fix and wants to perfect. And that's something that we've brought up quite a bit too, Dan, is look, John Michael Schmitz, we talk about his run game and hey, he might be better for zone because that's what he ran a lot at Minnesota, and the Giants run a lot more power gap, right? Well, I'm not even really concerned about the run blocking as much as I'm concerned about his ineffectiveness as a pass blocker. That was, I think, the thing I was most concerned about from his 2023 tape was him losing, not to the Shane Lemieux degree. I'm not going to act like he was that poor, but he was not nearly as sturdy as he was in college. And it seemed to be a huge jump, and he didn't necessarily adapt to that jump throughout the season as I would have hoped.
Yeah, you're exactly right. This was my biggest concern with him pre-draft, going from the level of competition, the Big Ten, to the NFL level, as far as who he has to go against in these one-on-one situations as a pass blocker. And he, like you said, he was very, I thought this was really, like you say, it wasn't an electric interview, but he was an honest interview, right? He said, I had to seriously look back at my film, which, by the way, shows how much work he's putting in. I feel like he's a Daniel Jones type of the offensive line, from gets there early, leaves there late, does everything right, says everything right, and puts in the time and work. I hope that it's going to make a difference. It can sometimes, and sometimes it won't. But like you said, we'll see this year, because he said I need to make strides in my initial set in pass pro. He says I need to make strides in sustaining blocks at the second level. I need to finish both in the run and pass game, he said. So everything was very detailed from him. He looked back at the tape and really took the time to see what he needs to improve. I think he's got it from the mental standpoint, Nick. I want to see it from the physical standpoint this year.
He was candid too. Like when John Michael Schmitz said, this is the second time I did it. John Schmelk said something to the effect of, how did you think last year went? It was kind of like a little bit of a pause. And he was like, look, I'm not gonna lie. It was tough. It was a tough season for all of us. It was tough for me. And I appreciate that. And I don't really understand exactly or know how else you would handle that type of question, how else you would answer that type of question. Very obvious that it was tough, but he seems to understand by all of those answers that he provided, John Schmelk, that I kind of let people down last year. I was not the player I wanted to be, and I'm going to fix that heading into this season. And we are setting expectations that are very high, because we are a very confident group now under Carmen Brasillo with all the additions that we've made. I think the John Runyon and Jermaine Illuminor additions, look, not the flashiest thing, not the sexiest thing in the world. I think that can make a world of difference for John Michael Schmitz. And I just love the fact that John Runyon is praising John Michael Schmitz, because John Michael Schmitz is helping those veterans adjust to this complex offense.
You nailed that, Nick. And I think the key thing you brought up here is something we've discussed so many times with the Giants offensive line. Why have things not gone the way we've wanted them to from an offensive line standpoint for so long? It's not because the Giants don't have all-stars on their offensive line. It's because the weak links of the line have brought everything else down. And if you ask all these great offensive line coaches around the NFL, the majority have said the same thing. I'm not as concerned about getting stars on my line. I'm concerned about eliminating a weak link, because a weak link on a line kills an entire offense. We've seen this happen year after year after year with Giants. And yes, like you said, will John Runyon and Jermaine Illuminor be stars? Probably not. It's not a guarantee. You never know. Things happen randomly in the NFL, and they could break out this late into their career. But what we're hoping they're not going to be, and what I'm pretty confident they're not going to be, is weak links on your offensive line, devastatingly bad pieces that bring the entire group down. And that's why I'm excited and honestly, in a lot of ways, cautiously optimistic, because that's very cautiously optimistic if you're talking about the Giants offensive line, to take a step forward. And Jermaine Illuminor himself has been like, said in his interview, like, I almost feel like I'm a second coach out there. He says, I'm probably the oldest guy in the offensive line. And I know the system. I've been with Carmen Brasillo in 3 different stops. I'm helping these guys get caught up from a mental standpoint, which I think is really important. He mentioned, by the way, when they asked him, because John Schmeelk's like, oh, if things go wrong, there's injuries, you're going to play tackle. He's like, no, I don't think so. Like, I think we have a lot of trust if injuries happen in the players that are behind our 2 big tackles. And he mentioned Josh Azudu as one of those guys. I think it's not an experiment at this point, Nick. I think Azudu is going to be a tackle for the Giants.
I'm interested to see what Matt Nelson contributes in training camp. The offensive lineman, the 6'8" offensive lineman the Giants signed over from Detroit. Because I think he could earn that swing tackle spot if Azudu's not up for it. And I'm willing to give Azudu another shot at tackle if you give him like an entire year of being able to practice at that position, because he's just been bounced around so much. I think it's been a little bit unfair for Josh Azudu, and the injuries obviously have impacted his career. It's unfortunate that there wasn't an Azudu interview in the Schmeelk podcast. I would have loved to hear from him, but McKeithen was interviewed, as was Schlottman. I think they asked Schlottman about, are you going to play any guard? And it was more like, maybe, but I'm not 100% certain. So I wonder if we look at Austin Schlottman, is that a player who, like, what do you think the odds of him making this team are? Because last year we had the Hassenauer kid. He ended up going down with a triceps injury, but we wanted that backup to John Michael Schmitz to be a veteran center. And I'm wondering if Schlottman can earn that spot on this roster on the final 53. And if he has that positional versatility, that will certainly help him.
Yeah, I think does he have the versatility? And we'll see in camp, I think, right? Because that's when it really matters what's going on in camp in the offensive line. They brought in more pieces than typical to try to kind of, I don't want to say throw numbers at the problem, but at least give themselves an opportunity where if injuries do happen again, like they have in the past, the offensive line, they have some guys who have been in the system, have been through the OTAs, have been through the mandatory mini camps, so they understand from the mental standpoint, they can step right in. And then from that point, figure out where to go. So I'm hoping you're right, but I want to see it with those guys, because I think we have to kind of, not trial by fire, but just kind of see how they fit in with everybody else. One more thing on Jermaine Illuminor that I thought was interesting, Nick, that I want to get your take on. He mentioned specifically Andrew Thomas and John Michael Schmitz are the 2 super smartest on this line who know this offense like the back of their hand. I just found it interesting, Nick, that, Thomas, of course, given, but he's been with the system for both years. But JMS just got here last year. It was his first year in the system. Like, it's not like he mentioned Evan Neal or, Josh or whoever as knowing this offense like the back of their hand. JMS, the guy who's only been here for 1 year, is really well tuned with the offense. I just want to believe, Nick, that JMS's mental, the advantage he has from an IQ standpoint will show up on the field as early as this year. That's where a lot of my cautious optimism does come from.
And look, Bobby Johnson, the big rumor was the reason why he fell in love with John Michael Schmitz and felt like he needed John Michael Schmitz was because of that intellect, was because of how fast his processing was and how he was able to discuss the offensive line with Bobby Johnson, protections against different fronts, things of that nature. So hopefully Carmen Brasillo benefits from that choice by Bobby Johnson to bring him along.
And did you take anything away, Nick, from the Evan Neal interview?
I have feeling good health-wise written down.
Okay.
Other than that, there wasn't too much. Like John Schmeelk said something like referencing, I don't remember exactly how he said it, but something about how like his issues with the offensive line, and Evan Neal was just like, yeah, whatever you guys want to label it as. Or he said something to that effect. But he was like, I basically just want to be more consistent. First, get healthy. I'm feeling good right now. Get more, and then I can develop consistency and hit the ground running. But I didn't really have too many takeaways. What about you?
Well, that was kind of my takeaway, which you just said. It didn't feel like he really was willing to get specific in any way. Schmeelk led him in a lot of ways, like hand placement, balance, positioning, those areas, and he improved, whatever you want to call them. Like, it's not whatever you want to call them, really, Evan Neal. These are specific areas where I'd love to hear you get a little specific on ways that you can get better, but that's not something he offers. He talked about how Carmen Brasillo can help him with set angle, his stance, how he carry his hands, how I see the game, recognize the defensive front, safety rotations, and where the pressure is coming from. Great. That's awesome. But he also then said very generally, Carmen Brasillo will help me improve by coaching me. I also, heard him say again in this interview, something he said before, I just need to, get reps and be the player I know I can be. Right. Well, guess what, Evan? At some point, it's not about being the player you know you can be. You're very confident in yourself, and that's fine. At some point, it's about actually, in my mind at least, having a little vulnerability and understanding that things have not gone the way that you know they can be. And maybe there are reasons for that. Maybe you can unpack that, and maybe you can look for specific things that have led to what has gone down. I like a player having confidence in himself, Nick, but at some point I would love a player to do kind of what John Michael Schmidt said and say, look, it was really rough to go back and watch the tape of my rookie year, but I had to do it. And I had to get really specific and detailed in what I need to improve. I'm not saying Evan Neal hasn't done that and is just unwilling to share it with John Michael Schmitz, but I can't get confirmation on that at all from this interview. And in a lot of ways, Nick, it almost leads me to the other way. Like, is he really taking the time to grind the tape and get specific with why things have gone to where they've gone to? So I can't say I came away from that Evan Neal side of this interview very, very, I guess, optimistic.
I didn't look into it so much, and I'm not throwing shade your way or anything, but it's very easy to look at Evan Neal through that type of filter, to just kind of be negative about Evan Neal right now, because the expectations we had of Evan Neal was that we were getting this beautiful, filet mignon or whatever, just cooked freaking great, London broil, whatever your cut is. And instead we got like Taco Bell quality meat. So I think we just
the Taco Bell part.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not even trying to throw shade at Evan Neal. This is the reality of the situation. He is not living up to the expectations of being a top 10 pick in the draft, to the point where we're holding it to the feet of our general manager and saying, like, if he doesn't work out, like, you might be done. Like, this is a big indictment on Joe Shane if Evan Neal flounders at right tackle. And then we're just hoping that he can play guard. And then to the point that we were making before about Jermaine Illuminor, he's like, yeah, I like that answer by Jermaine Illuminor, but I also think it's bullshit. I think if week 2 or 3 rolls around and the right tackle position is a problem, in week 4, Jermaine Illuminor is going to be the starting right tackle, unless Josh Azudu or Matt Nelson, who I think is a wild card, can really show a certain level of development for Azudu's case, or competency for Nelson's case, to anchor that spot down. But then at that point, if it's not injury related, what do you do with Evan Neal?
Right. That in its own right is a major issue, because at that point, if you tell him kick inside the guard, like we've discussed in the past, Nick, it will even have the confidence to where does that do?
Not even just that. It's like, if you kick inside the guard, cool. Which spot?
Right.
If everybody's healthy. So Illuminor would probably kick out the right tackle.
Oh, I see what you're saying. If they need Illuminor, then they need a guard at that point. But then you're really taking a risk there, I think, which maybe, you know what, Nick, I don't think that we've even talked about this, but I just thought about this. Maybe the whole reason why, oh no, never mind. I did this completely wrong in my head. I was thinking it would make more sense then if Illuminor was playing right guard and Neal was playing right tackle. So if they need to switch them, it's not as big of a jump. Now it's the opposite. We got Runyon out there. So if they do need to make that switch, we're going to be doing Neal inside to the right. Runyon now has to go to the left, or maybe Neal will play left guard, I guess, and flip back to that side and play left guard next to Andrew Thomas. I don't even know, man. It's not ideal.
And I don't want the New York Giants to base their starting offensive line right now on if Evan Neal doesn't work out. Like, I think you go in there, and that's why I'm like completely, if Runyon's best at right guard, you give him the reps at right guard, he'll be ready at right guard. Illuminor at left guard, and I just hope Illuminor in the case that Neal does not work out at right tackle, he is professional enough to just switch to right tackle after playing left guard. It's not an ideal situation. Or Illuminor goes and becomes a swing offensive lineman, depending on how he's doing, or if Neal does, which is like the worst case scenario. And then Matt Nelson or Josh Azudu ends up playing right tackle if they have that development and competency we were talking about. But at least, like, the one positive takeaway I can grab at right now is maybe, Dan, just the influx of players that the Giants have received, of competent football players, like even Aaron Stinnie, who haven't even brought up yet. That's going to benefit the Giants, because last year they didn't have that. They didn't have any depth. So the Giants at least have the depth right now to handle the issue of Evan Neal not working out at right tackle.
I think it's fair, and that's what we're banking on. But you know what? A lot of this is still uncertain, Nick, and I will say this as we head into the days before training camp. This is where I'm most excited to track in camp, the offensive line and where they're developing, including in the preseason. Because, look, I will give credit to those who say we spend a lot of time on quarterback, and in the end, the quarterback won't make much of a difference if the offensive line doesn't get to at least a competent level. And to be quite frank and fair, it was somewhat competent in 2022, but that's not even the goal. Like, we need better than that. We need, again, I've said this before, I'm not expecting miracles here, Nick. I just want league average this year. Just get me the 15th or 16th best offensive line, and it's a massive win for us. And I'm not going to say a miracle, though. I really won't, because I am cautiously optimistic that they can develop this line into a top 15, 16 unit. Because why the hell not? They have a locked-in best, one of the 3 best left tackles in the freaking NFL you can put on an island. They have a 7th overall pick at right tackle. They have a 55th overall pick at center. And they just signed 2 guys to start at the other 2 positions. Like, this should be it, dude. We should have this thing in place to at least be a 15th best unit. God, just make it work in training camp, Priscilla. Find a way to fast track this development is all I'm hoping for.
And if injuries do affect the New York Giants, you have some options at right tackle and you have multiple options inside now. You did not have that last year. You did not. That's why I'm most optimistic about the New York Giants offensive line heading into this season than I've been since I've done this podcast. And I know that's not saying that much because the Giants have been so bad. The Giants offensive line specifically has been so bad, but you have a center now who has a year under his belt. You have Andrew Thomas playing at an elite level. Hopefully Evan Neal can be healthy because it does seem like injuries have slowed him down. And you have all the veterans that you just discussed. Last year, who the hell were the contingency plans? We noticed that after the first drive in week 1. And speaking on Andrew Thomas, that was another thing that was revealed on this podcast was he wasn't healthy the entire season. He said his hamstring did not feel 100% until the end of January into February. And his run blocking specifically is what suffered because going forward and pushing off the hamstring, he felt like he wasn't playing up to his potential. He said his pass blocking was okay. He said it was solid. He can move and still dance, but just going forward and driving through like a 300-pounder really affected him.
And we knew he was playing hurt. He was not playing his fully 100%. We said that a lot just from watching the tape. It wasn't the same elite. It was still somehow he was great in Bass Pro despite playing hurt. But it just goes to show there's another level we're going to get out of Andrew Thomas this year if he can stay healthy, which we hope is the case. And that could also be another reason to leave for optimism. But I wonder, I have to think more about your statement as if this is the most excited I've been since we started doing this podcast about the offensive line in the preseason. Because I might argue that before the 2022 season would be the area for me, just because my expectation at that point was that we were going to get a immediate top almost 15 or 10 right tackle out of Evan Neal. I really just thought he'd hit the ground running and he was going to be like an Orlando Brown type, like too long to really beat around the edge. But it's hard for me to be as optimistic about that happening now with Neal as it was 2 years ago. But I do think the pieces around him have definitely improved. The interior, this is the most excited I've ever been about the interior Giants offensive line for sure.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think right now I'm still a little bit more excited than them. Like then we had Mark Lewinsky coming in and I would say we were a little bit optimistic about Mark Lewinsky. Feliciano, we were a little indifferent to. I think Feliciano outperformed Mark Lewinsky. And then left guard, it was, Ben Bredesen or Josh Azuda.
Wow. Yeah, that wasn't great. But
I feel better personally about Illuminor, Runyon, John Michael Schmitz than those 3. And Evan Neal was still a rookie. We expected top 15 by the end of the season, possibly, but he was at right tackle, obviously not a tackle, but he was still a rookie. And we even figured when we drafted Evan Neal that it wasn't going to be a smooth rookie season. We thought there were going to be some bumps. I think it was probably a little bit worse than we expected.
Way worse than we expected.
Yeah, and then the jump the second season, it's just like really down in the dumps because there was no jump. Schmelk referenced, hey, those injuries, the knee and the ankle, and I don't want to throw that out of the window and just say, oh, well, you should have overcame it because you were playing. Those are serious issues, but it does seem like his issues weren't just because of his knee and his ankle. There are balance issues. There are high. There's just bad timing with his hand.
Which he's really willing to address specifically. Not to read too much into it, but it's the fact of the matter. He really never has addressed any of them specifically, like we heard John Michael Schmitz do.
Yeah, so that's something that's interesting to me when it comes to Evan Neal. Evan Neal, look, man, he's had a bumpy start here. The flipping burgers comment was just such a poor choice of words, and I get it. He was frustrated. Yeah. He's a kid. He's never really dealt with professional adversity or football adversity in his life because he was always just the best player, 5-star recruit, went to a top high school, IMG Academy, then ends up going to Alabama, and now he's in the biggest freaking just spotlight in the entire NFL world, and you're not playing well, and he's hearing it. So I'm hoping, man, if he can come out and just be league average, that is a huge win at this point, which isn't necessarily a great thing because we were expecting more than a league average, but I'll take it at this
We'll
point.
take that. We'll take
Oh,
that
absolutely.
win these days. All right, that's all the time we have from today's Big Blue Banter podcast. Thank you so much for listening and tuning in. Keep it locked and loaded. Please download. Please rate, subscribe, do all those things if you haven't already, but I assume most of you have. And hit like on this video if you're watching on YouTube. Thanks again. Have a great rest of your week, and we'll talk to you soon.